As predictions of a booming market for electric vehicles, or EVs, abound, complete with government incentives to buy them, we hear a steady stream of headlines about lithium prices. Record highs last year, down 30% this year. Of course, lithium is only one of the raw materials in batteries that power EVs. Equally essential are cobalt, nickel, and graphite. The rate of EV adoption among consumers could be slowed significantly if supply shortages drive their price too high for most buyers. Even now, EV drivers are mainly among the affluent, and some forecasters see demand flattening due to their lack of affordability for anyone else. The Inflation Reduction Act and other government incentives around the world can't create more of these raw materials overnight, and the mining life cycle moves at its own pace. A number of years ago, I conducted an Equator Principles gap assessment in preparation for permitting a lithium mine in Argentina's Lithium Triangle, host to more than half of the world's resources. Today, more studies and community engagement are ongoing at the still undeveloped project site. Today, as part one of our lithium series, I'm delighted to welcome Jessica Roberts, Head of Forecasting for Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Jessica leads Benchmark's global team of analysts, providing in-depth market analysis, long-term forecasts, and cost analysis for key battery and electric vehicle raw materials. I first encountered Jessica early this year when she gave a compelling, if frightening, presentation at the Mineral, Energy, and Supply Chains Conference of the Society for Mining, Metallurgy, and Exploration. In a moment, she'll join us from the UK. Stay tuned. Inside ESG is a timely new production which takes you inside the work of practitioners on the ground, chief risk officers, market analysts, cybersecurity experts, and founders of game-changing startups. We'll talk with specialists in every corner of the globe, across industries and issues, dropping into Argentina to hear about lithium mining, Central Asia for a view of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and West Africa for a perspective on climate risk, among other stops. Welcome to the show, Jessica.
Hi, Maureen. Great to see you.
Well, since we last spoke, as usual, you were very busy with forecasting. Could you just tell us briefly? I know you cover the whole lithium-ion battery supply chain, but I bet most people wouldn't realize that not only are you looking at factors like mine supply and production levels and even exploration activity, but you're looking at the recycling sector and the technology behind it. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about, what's in your universe.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, happy to. I think with Benchmark, what we've realized over time is that to do these markets justice, it's not enough just to be looking at, say, one part of it. It's got to be the whole supply chain and that circularity component, like you mentioned as well. So understanding recycling and what's coming back from there. But in terms of our universe, we would say that we are the foremost experts, come to us for the intelligence on the lithium-ion battery supply chain. So what are the different raw material components that all feed into eventually making a lithium-ion battery? And the way that we would look at it is you've got, obviously, in terms of the battery components, it's going to be things like your cathode raw materials, so things like lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese. It's going to be your anode components, so predominantly graphite in flake graphite form, which is the mined one, or synthetic graphite, which is the synthetically manufactured version. And then actually another research area that we're just starting to get more into and will be coming out in the next few months with some concrete data on this as well is silicon as an anode raw material too, because this is one of the developments that we're seeing in the anode supply chain also. So yeah, there's lots of coverage in terms of what goes into a battery for the anode and cathode. You've also got the battery chemicals that will maybe be involved in things like the electrolyte. And then there are other constituents like the anode and cathode foils themselves as well. So things like copper, aluminium too. So there's a huge amount of different raw materials that you need to really make a lithium-ion battery.
Right. And I know that you're uncovering rather alarming shortages in many of these materials. And every time I read another either government target about, rising EV levels, and I keep thinking about how can these be met when, you and your team are finding such a disconnect between projected demand, even current demand, but projected demand in all of these raw materials to power the EVs and what's going on to produce them. And I know you're coming up with some pretty massive investment levels that are going to be required to meet those. But I wonder if you just wanted to tell us a bit about that. By the way, to our listening audience, you can go to the show notes and find a reference to Benchmark Minerals and how you can see some of these charts and graphics about the shortfalls in materials.
Really good question, Maureen. And I think when we look at the lithium-ion battery supply chain, we're sort of looking at it from a historical perspective through to now and how it's evolved in that time. And then further ahead, our forecasts are done on a long-term basis. So we're forecasting out to 2040. And of course, that's going to be taking into account certain assumptions about how we think these markets are going to evolve. But what we can see in terms of the supply visibility for each of these crucial battery raw materials, because we're tracking everything on a mine or asset level basis. So we're building up a very detailed picture of what's the supply that's actually going to be operational and available, and what's being planned as projects and being invested in at the moment. And all of the data from that analysis compared with our demand view shows that actually each of the main raw materials is heading for a pretty substantial supply gap or deficit over the coming years. Now, the timing of those is different depending on which specific raw material you're looking at. But yeah, the overwhelming picture is one of very, very large supply gaps forming in the market longer term, which really I would frame as a massive call for new investments to be made in order to ensure that actually the demand levels that we're projecting can be satisfied.
Right. And it's not just in production. When I looked at your interesting chart on just the recycling sector, $24 billion of investment needed, right, in the technology and facilities for recycling.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think recycling is a absolutely key part of the supply chain, is only going to get more important for lots of different reasons. And I suppose maybe just touching in on one of those in more detail. But if you think about the fact that a lot of the supply chain security is really defined by what you've got access to as a country. And if we take that back to the mine level, not all countries will have mines that they can open for these raw materials. That's where recycling really comes in as something that's of paramount importance for a lot of these sort of Western governments, where they know they can't actually mine these raw materials in their own countries because they don't have the geology that's right. But with recycling investments, that gives them power over their supply chain all of a sudden, because they can install recycling facilities, and if they can get the scrap that they need in order to run through these facilities, all of a sudden they've got access to the raw materials that they need to make their own batteries, and that really gives you a huge amount of security over your supply chain.
Hi, it's Maureen Upton, host and producer of the Inside ESG podcast. I hope you're enjoying this episode. I wanted to take a moment to tell you about Inside ESG's advisory services. If your team could use expert advice in ESG strategy and integration, performance against different metrics and frameworks, or workshop design and facilitation, visit insideesg.com/advisory to see how we might be able to help. Or email info@insideesg.com. See the show notes for links. Now, let's get back to our episode. Not only does not every country have the mineral deposits that one might need for their own production, but they also might not be able to obtain the permits and especially social license As we know, mining is not that popular as an industry among a lot of groups and in a lot of regions. Actually, that brings me to another lens on the kind of disconnect between projected demand and supply that you've mentioned before, which is the shortage in mine workforce that we're going to be looking at. And I'm sure some of those factors are, and mining isn't necessarily the most popular career to go into. Are you finding the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, tracking the mining workforce isn't something that's kind of our bread and butter at Benchmark, but we come across comments from companies during our research about the difficulties that they're finding in trying to secure the workforce that they need. So this is one of the factors that will affect a company or a project success will be, can they actually get the workforce that they need? Can they get the labor that they need? And what is the cost of that labor going to be as well? And at least in Western countries, if you look at traditionally big mining countries like Australia or Canada or the US, we can see that there is generally a trend towards young people moving out of, in terms of education, moving out of mining and geology courses, looking at the mining sector as something that they just don't want to be involved with. And from a personal perspective, I did a geology degree, and then I came into mining and market analysis straight out of university, and I've always found it absolutely fascinating. But I think I've always been aware that there are obviously some companies that do things right in the mining industry and some that don't do it right. But I'm not sure that the mining sector itself necessarily talks enough about the good things that it's doing. And I think it'll be great to listen to the podcast that you've got with my colleague Charlotte, our head of sustainability research, because a lot of what she's doing, her and her team, in terms of sustainability research, is I think key to the mining industry showing that it is doing things the right way. And when you've got hard data like that, you can start to use it to sort of say to young people who are perhaps choosing what career path they want to go down. Look, these companies are doing it right. And actually, the overall trend that we see is sustainability is becoming more and more important to companies and to people that are involved in extractive supply chains. So I think it's something that urgently needs to be addressed, because if you look at material extraction in the lens of the climate crisis that we're in terms of the investments that we urgently need to make in clean energy technologies, clean tech is all underpinned by raw materials. So actually, if we want to make all of these energy transition goals possible with clean tech, then we need the raw materials to make that happen. So we need people coming into these markets, coming into these industries to help us achieve those targets. And at the moment, that looks challenging because I think, as you say, Maureen, there is a concern, particularly from the younger generation, that mining's just, it's a dirty industry. And I think we could do a lot more as a sector to talk about the good things that the industry is doing.
So not only are mined materials going to be driving this whole clean tech and decarbonization movement, but I think a lot of people look at it and say, okay, well, mining's kind of a necessary evil to get there, thinking that it's this negative activity that, whose products will bring positive outcomes, when actually mining activity itself dwarfs most other industries in terms of the activity's impact on the sustainable development goals. It doesn't matter if you're looking at a diverse workforce, providing opportunities for local suppliers to feed their families, poverty reduction, dealing with huge public health problems. So, yeah, you're right. People don't know that, but hopefully we can help change that with our discussion.
Yeah, hopefully we can. And you're absolutely right. The ability of a country, I suppose, to improve the lives of its population, its communities. Mining and extractive industries can play a massive role in doing that when it's all done the right way. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of upside if we can ensure that these sectors are all being developed responsibly.
But there's also, in terms of just the material shortage, I know you've thought a lot about innovation as a mitigating factor for this disconnect. And you've mentioned to me before innovations in battery pack size.
If we look at the supply gaps that we've modeled, all of those models are sort of making lots of different assumptions about what will be the size of the batteries that are in electric vehicles, and what will be the penetration rate of electric vehicles versus the overall car market. And so when we've looked at raw material shortages as a constraining factor on the electric vehicle market, in our base case view, electric vehicle penetration rates reach about 60% of total sales in 2040. Under a scenario where raw material availability is constrained, where there hasn't been enough investment, the penetration rate drops to about 40% by 2040. But this is assuming that the size of the battery in electric vehicles on average is going to get larger over time. There's going to be requirements for electric vehicles to have longer ranges. In particular geographies, that's absolutely key to people feeling confident in electric vehicles and moving away from internal combustion engine vehicles. I'd say especially in really big countries like where you are, Maureen, people don't want to be worried about range anxiety. So our expectation is that the average size of batteries is going to get bigger in electric vehicles. But actually, that is one of the levers that companies can pull if the raw material availability is going to be an issue. So if you keep battery packs on a smaller size, the raw material intensity within them, you need less raw materials if your battery size is smaller. So you can maintain overall sales and units of electric vehicles, but they just won't have as big a battery within them. And that's one of the ways that the industry could potentially move and could potentially react if there are issues around the availability of raw materials.
To me, has always struck me as very encouraging because there's been many national government targets rolling out lately for electric vehicle penetration, both in various US states, such as here in Colorado, and countries around the world. And I think that type of innovation can make those targets much more achievable. Because I have heard a sort of pessimistic forecast that we've seen the peak of electric vehicle penetration, at least in the US, because of the affordability issue. All the people that can afford them have them. And now even they might not be able to replace them unless we have adequate supply chain, including recycling, because they just won't be affordable. So that'll cap off the penetration, but not if there's this innovation to mitigate it, hopefully.
As an electric vehicle manufacturer, you have a choice in terms of the type of battery that you use in your electric vehicle as well. I think sometimes there's a tendency to sort of think of lithium-ion batteries as just sort of one uniform product. And actually, there are loads of different types, loads of different chemistries. Some of them, say lithium-ion phosphate, that doesn't have any cobalt or nickel in. So potentially, if nickel cobalt shortages in the future are going to be impacting the ability to produce electric vehicle batteries, then maybe we see a switch to lithium iron phosphate because that is a chemistry that could still be produced, and vice versa. If sort of lithium starts to become an issue, then maybe we start to see a switch to more novel next generation battery chemistries as well. We've done some very interesting research on solid state batteries, some very interesting research on sodium ion batteries, and while solid state wouldn't necessarily get you around the lithium problem, there's still lots and lots of lithium in a solid state battery. But sodium ion, for instance, you're looking at the use of like a soda ash feedstock, where the availability of raw materials is pretty good. So that there's always innovations that can be made if there are issues with one part of the supply chain. But they do take time. It's not like, I don't want to sort of suggest that sodium ion is something that's available here today and could be dropped in straight away. I'm talking about sort of in a decade's time.
it does take some time from the R&D to production. Yeah, I have heard about those new innovations coming down the pipeline, and then also the use of organics in batteries that could power EVs. And there's a lot of exciting work going on, and there's so much demand for those options that I think and hope they'll get a lot of funding. For example, I learned about the work going on around organics and EV batteries by attending the battery brunch. If anyone's interested in some of the details and what's going on in batteries, it's a LinkedIn group put on by Volta Foundation called the Battery Brunch, and it's a monthly live event on LinkedIn, and fascinating speakers and researchers and startups. There's just a lot of innovative people working in this space, so that's very encouraging. Thank you again for coming on the show today. It's so interesting to catch up with you, and your work is incredibly relevant to all of our daily lives. So thanks again.
Thanks, Maureen. Yeah, really great to see you.
Thanks for joining us today. To make sure you don't miss out on our next episode, subscribe to the Inside ESG podcast on Spotify or any podcast platform, the YouTube channel, the LinkedIn newsletter, and our mailing list on InsideESG.com. See you next time.